So the questions that will guide the discussion today are on Blackboard and are as follows. Who is Louis Althusser? What is ideology? What are state apparatuses and what are their examples? What is the relationship between the ideological and repressive apparatuses? What are your personal experiences of the manifestation of either type of state apparatus in your life or the lives of people around you? Now, responding to the first question, who is Louis Althusser? Louis Althusser is or was a French Marxist philosopher. I will add that he was also an educational theorist. He was born in Algeria, Africa, in 1918. And if you remember Marx's history, you will remember that Marx was born in 1818. So Althusser is born exactly 100 years after Marx's birth and a couple of decades after his death. Althusser is born during really messed up times in the year where the First World War ends. So there's global political turmoil, the world is licking its wounds from traumas of war, and there's disease and famine all around. So when Althusser is able to leave Algeria and seek greener pastures, he does exactly that and settles in Paris. This is a move that makes sense because Algeria is a North African country with a history of French colonialism. So Althusser, like most other Algerians even today who speak and write in French, spoke and wrote in French. He settled in Paris, enrolled in a university there, works in that university ultimately as a professor, and also joins the French Communist Party. As it is hinted in his lifelong membership in the French Communist Party, Althusser was a Marxist and by default a communist. This is basically to say that he agreed with and believed in the work of Karl Marx, who hated capitalism and wanted to see a world where the ownership of property, land, and other resources was not privatized, but everyone shared these and was equal in wealth and social status. So Althusser lived during very interesting economic times because in his prime he experienced the Second World War, the Cold War, lots of African countries fighting for and attaining political independence from their colonizers, the Vietnam War, American Civil Rights Movement, and so on. Althusser was a Marxist because I think he could see the chaos that was in the world resulting from greed and corruption, which Marxists argue is a byproduct of capitalism. All these experiences are enough to make a person go crazy, which he did. At some point, he strangled his wife to death and experienced deep regret for it after, and even confusion about the sequence of events that relate to this. Some argue that he killed his wife with intent and was able to get away with it or plead insanity in court because of his career as a well-known Marxist and university professor. I think he was also a heavy smoker because when I stalked him online, he smoked on most of the videos and pictures. So Althusser is a very shaky character, nothing close to perfect. I think a very interesting case study about mental health and trauma during colonial global crisis and that type of thing. But we are grateful for his work nonetheless. Please note that there is no exam question that will ask you to give the brief history of Althusser's life or anything like that. This is contextual information that can help you understand better the stance and arguments that this philosopher took and to place it in world history. Remember that the teacher is a lifelong learner, so you need to know these things. This is similar to how you will not get a question asking you when Marx was born or asking you about his nationality. But all those factors and the context around his life help clarify certain things about his argumentation. A question I've been getting a lot is about the connection between Marx and Althusser. Students have been asking how these two theorists correlate. Well, in the brief explanation about Althusser above, I did say that he was a Marxist. This is to say that Althusser's body of work was guided by or based on Marxist ideology. So in terms of essay writing, the introduction to any essay about Althusser definitely has to start by explaining that Althusser agreed with Marxist ideology, then briefly explain what that Marxist ideology is, which, when oversimplified, is the hate for capitalism and the belief that economic resources should be equally shared instead of being privately owned. After explaining that, you will go on to state that your essay will discuss the concept of ideology and state apparatuses as guided by the work of Althusser. You will see how the foundation of Marxism is again important when you're answering the rest of the questions. So in responding to the second question, we're trying to understand what is ideology, because this forms a great part of the work that Louis Althusser wrote about. Ideology is a system of ideas or ways of thinking. It is a collection of ideas shared by a group of people, let's say people who share a similar culture or religion or specific type of belief system. Even Marxism itself is an ideology because it is a set of ideas which have united people across the planet who believe in the equal sharing of economic resources and disapprove of capitalism. Ideology is a system of underlying ideas or principles which guide how a group of people think and believe at that time. If we look at the writings of Plato, Peters, and so on, we see them referring to only men when they write about education and work. Peters wants to define what an educated man looks like. Marx hates capitalism because it alienates the working men, while Plato believes that certain men are created to be rulers while others are created to be servants. We see clearly here that the underlying ideology of these men is patriarchy. They don't talk a lot about women and their existence or their education and work. This is because they lived during a time where women were not seen as appropriate for work or education. So that type of patriarchal ideology is reflected in their work and how they write about the world as if there's just one gender existing in it. These men were probably totally unaware that there is a thing called patriarchy and that this is an ideology that guided how they wrote, because to them, that's just how things work. What's important to note about ideology is that you are never really aware of the ideology that guides you. It just comes naturally as a result of the influences you've been exposed to throughout your life. So you just go about your life doing the most, being guided by your different ideologies to make decisions and formulate opinions about things. This ideology can range from your religion, your culture, your country's political system, etc. Ideologies form a very integral part of people's lives because your ideologies as a person dictate how you live. People are even willing to die for certain ideologies. We have seen certain religious groups in history being persecuted, for instance, because they are Christians in a Muslim country or something like that. The best example of how ideology is important to people can be the "I have fought against black domination" speech by Nelson Mandela. Mandela held close to his heart the ideology of equality and racial integration and reconciliation. So he was willing to even die if that helped achieve the world he envisioned or believed in, where all races would be equal. He had to fight because the ideology of the apartheid government was segregation and discrimination. These ideologies clearly couldn't coexist, so one had to die. The discussion around ideology is very deep because the world has witnessed an entire war based on competing ideologies, the Cold War. I'm not going to get deep into this, but I will remind you that America and the Soviet Union were engaged in a very unique type of war for over 45 years. This was right after the Second World War, where these nations threatened each other, creating nuclear weapons because they disagreed on the economic ideologies that guide each of them. The USA is a pro-capitalism state, while the USSR or Soviet Union is for communism. A lot happened during this time, and lives were lost, all because at the core of this war were clashing ideologies and a race to becoming the next global superpower. What I'm trying to point out here is that ideology can be good and that it can be bad. Homophobia is an ideology. Christianity is an ideology. Even xenophobia. These are systems of ideas which guide how one views certain things. So Althusser talks about the ideological superstructure, where he says that we are all conditioned one way or another to believe things that may or may not be true. He basically argues that human agency does not really exist because we do things based on our ideologies, which we do not really choose. We are subtly pressured or pushed into them by an invisible hand, where we find ourselves believing in things because this is what we were exposed to. The third question is, what are state apparatuses and what are their examples? Note that this is very important for essay writing. You cannot write any Althusser essay without including ideological state apparatuses and repressive state apparatuses, because this is the important extension that he does to the work of Marx, as you will see briefly. So the first type of apparatus is the ideological state apparatuses, which are institutions that achieve the interpolation or oppression of people in soft underlying measures. Ideological state apparatus institutions include religion, education, the media, culture, the family structure, and so on. These institutions impart ideology which keeps capitalism in place or makes people think it's right in a very low-key way. You can't see it. For example, the Bible encourages slaves to be faithful to their masters. Life orientation will advise you to be a respectful employee, and your culture tells you that you need to respect the king and so on. ISA uses psychological means of conditioning and leading society to build certain ways of behavior. What all state apparatuses do is to reproduce all the relations or means of the production, basically making sure that the things remain exactly as they are. They don't change. We all want to go to school, go to university, get a job, get a nice house and car, get married and die a dignified death. This is the life we are taught to aspire to via the media, by our teachers, parents, and so on. We can't conclude that it's right or wrong, but we have to admit that it's not a unique way of thinking. It is a way that we are conditioned into. We are born wanting to achieve those things. So this is the connection between Marx and Althusser. Althusser says, listen, I agree with Marx. Capitalism sucks. But then Althusser goes an extra mile, asking himself how the hell capitalism stays in place when we can see that it's oppressive. He investigates and concludes that we are all conditioned by these different ideological state apparatuses to believe that it's right, to believe that poverty is a result of laziness, that if I work hard enough, I can achieve anything I put my mind to, and that we need to be respective citizens who uphold the law. As teachers in schools, we are using the hidden curriculum, which we have also acquired unaware in our own conditioning experiences when we were learners at school. We are trying to encourage learners to think and reason in certain ways to achieve certain results. We are subconsciously preparing them to be obedient employees in the capitalistic world, to be punctual and to be diligent. The second and last type of state apparatus is the repressive state apparatus, the RSA. This one relies on violence and force to achieve certain outcomes. Because the truth is, subtle oppression or conditioning always fails at some point. At some point, black people in South Africa started fighting against the oppression which resulted from oppressive and discriminatory ideology of apartheid. So when ideological state apparatuses fail, the repressive state apparatuses are used to achieve a certain outcome. RSA includes courts, the army, the police, the judiciary, and so on. If you don't pay taxes as a good citizen should, you are fined or you are punished by the court of law. If you rebel against the state, you are taken to prison. So basically, the objective of repressive state apparatuses also exists to reproduce the relations or the means of production, to maintain the inequality that is needed for capitalism to thrive. But it doesn't play with the mind like the ideological state apparatuses do. It uses force to punish resistance. This is Althusser's biggest contribution or extension to the works that Marx did, trying to understand why we don't act against capitalism or heed the call of Marx when he asked workers of the world to unite and revolt against their employers. So the last two questions we'll address are, what is the relationship between the ideological and repressive state apparatuses? And then the last thing you have to do is to reflect on your own experiences with the state apparatuses. The best example I can give of the relationship between ISA and RSA is Fees Must Fall in 2015 and 16, where people were punished and taken to prison so that they don't demand free education, because that's an anti-capitalistic type of requirement which is done in a capitalistic South Africa. So you can just look at those dynamics and examine how Fees Must Fall shows the relationship between ISA and RSA. And my experience with the state apparatuses is corporal punishment. When I didn't want to do my homework or come to school, obviously teachers would have to punish me or my other classmates in some way or another. So physical force is used when more psychological and gentle and subtle ways of making people do things fail. So that is the relationship between these two apparatuses. Kulungileke, bye. Thank you for tuning in. Hope this video was useful to you.